a little bit about determining whether to submit a 505(b)(2) application or an abbreviated new drug application. So going back to basics here, there are 2 very broad categories for your applications and 4 different pathways to take. So there's the new drug application, the NDA, and your abbreviated new drug application, your ANDA. So for the NDA, you can have a standalone new drug application that's submitted under B1 and approved under Section 505C of our Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The 505(b)(2) application is submitted under Section 505(b)(2), hence its name, and it's approved under Section 505C. The abbreviated new drug application, your ANDA, submitted and approved under Section 505J. And then finally, you can have a petitioned ANDA that's submitted under 505J2C and approved under J.
So in terms of comparing a generic application versus a B2 application, this slide lays out very nicely where the differences are. And we often think of the 505(b)(2) applications as sort of a hybrid between a 505(b)(1) and a generic or an ANDA, and you'll sort of see why as you look at this slide. So for an ANDA, and I think you've already gotten a good foundation for this, the applicant is submitting the manufacturing information. They are providing data that the product has demonstrated bioequivalence to the reference standard. They're providing labeling, and then they're providing patent certifications and exclusivity statements to deal with any kinds of patents that are out there. And then on the other side of the spectrum, a 505(b)(1) application is an application that contains the full reports where the applicant has done all the studies themselves. And in that regard, they provide clinical studies. They provide information about use in pediatrics. They provide all the manufacturing information in that application. They're also conducting PK, PD studies, non-clinical information. They are also providing the labeling, and they are providing patent information to the agency, but it's the patents that they want to have listed on their particular drug when it gets approved. And they're also providing a request for exclusivity if they are seeking it. And so a B2 application is a hybrid of those two in a sense, because the B2 application has the same standards of efficacy and safety and effectiveness, and needs to have full reports of investigations to cover all the areas that a B1 would have. But the difference is that some of the information is being leveraged from another source, and I'll get into that later. But again, a B2 has to have the preclinical, the clinical, pediatric information, manufacturing, and then in this particular instance, they're going to have some sort of bridging information, and that's often in the form of a PK or bioavailability study, and I'll get into that later. They also provide patent information for those patents that they want to have listed on their product later in the Orange Book. But like a generic, they also now have to respect, so to speak, any patents or intellectual property rights that are that exist on sources of information for which they want to rely on. So in this particular instance, we're talking about listed drugs.
So a little more detail about your ANDA. It's an application for a duplicate of a previously approved drug product, your reference listed drug. It demonstrates sameness to the RLD with respect to the active ingredient, route of administration, dosage form strength, previously approved conditions of use, and with certain exceptions, the labeling. Your ANDA includes sufficient information to demonstrate bioequivalence to the reference listed drug. It may contain certain differences from an RLD as long as investigations are not necessary to establish that the generic drug product is safe and effective.
So I mentioned a slide ago. So a B2 application does have to contain full reports of investigations in order to establish the safety and effectiveness of the product. But the difference between a B2 and a B1 is that they are leveraging some of the information that they need for approval from other sources. And specifically, studies that were not conducted by the applicant or for which the applicant does not have a right of reference. And in order to use that information that they don't own or have right of reference to, they also have to provide a bridge to that information. So it might be a bridge to listed drugs, literature, and what a bridge is it's either it's demonstration that the product they're proposing is similar to the product that they're trying to take the information from. So they have to prove that that information is relevant. In the case of B2s that rely on literature, they have to explain why that literature they're using is relevant to their proposed product. So again, this sort of summarizes what we've just been talking about, and it also sort of lays it out side by side, the comparisons. I'll start on the right-hand side. So for an ANDA, and you just heard about this, it's a duplicate product, and they have to base it on the product that is identified as the RLD in the Orange Book. Very different for a B2 application. A B2 application, unlike an ANDA, does not have to rely on the RLD product, and it can rely on more than one listed drugs if it wants to, more than one source of information. So it does not have to rely on the reference listed drug, and it does not have to rely on the reference standard. I say that, though, with the caveat that it has to make sense what product they choose to rely on as well. And most importantly is probably that third sub-bullet under the B2 application. Beginning in December of 2016, a regulation went into effect that requires that a B2 applicant must rely on a pharmaceutically equivalent product if one such product was approved in the Orange Book prior to the submission of the B2 application. So sometimes applicants have to rely on that for that regulatory reason alone, and perhaps they're relying on a different product for the scientific reasons, but that's another caveat to B2 applications. It's relatively new. And again, one more time on the bridge. So typically that bridge that I mentioned, when you're talking about reliance on listed drugs, they're typically bioavailability or bioequivalent studies comparing the proposed product to the product or products that they are relying on. Susan was talking about discontinued drugs in her talk, and a B2 applicant can also rely on a product that is discontinued. And in that situation, they would use an available generic version of that product to conduct the bridging studies. And then flipping back to the right-hand side, I think you've heard enough about that, where the ANDA applicant must use the reference standard to conduct their bioequivalent studies. One more quick point I want to make, and it's one of the key differences also between a B2 and a generic. For a B2 application, the applicant does not have to demonstrate bioequivalence to the listed drug or drugs that they're relying on, which is very different from the generic requirements. They have to show comparability such that it makes sense that they can rely on that listed drug or drugs. But a B2 applicant also has to support any differences that there might be between the product they're relying on and their own product. Because remember, a B2 is not a duplicate. If you're a duplicate, you're a generic. And so therefore, a B2 applicant has to support whatever those differences might be, they have to support that as well.
So the rest of the presentation is going to focus on these considerations when determining which of these abbreviated pathways is the most suitable for your proposed drug product. So the first, again, is this duplicates, and you've heard us use this word a lot already in the first few slides. So we will refuse to file a B2 application for a drug product that is a duplicate of a listed drug. And like Beth was mentioning about the pharmaceutical equivalence, if FDA approves a duplicate product after a 505(b)(2) application is submitted, but before it is approved, the application would remain eligible for approval as a B2 application. Petition ANDAs. So when our 4 little categories of your approval pathways. The last one was that petitioned ANDA, and this is referencing the suitability petition. It's a request for permission to submit an ANDA that differs from an RLD in its route of administration, dosage form, strength, or that it has one different active ingredient in a fixed combination drug product. An ANDA citing a suitability petition that has not been approved will not be received for FDA filing. So we will not approve a suitability petition if the safety and effectiveness of the proposed change cannot be evaluated without data that exceeds what may be submitted in an ANDA, or if it is for a drug product for which a pharmaceutical equivalent has been approved. So we want to emphasize this is really up to the prospective applicant. You can go the petitioned ANDA route if you have one of these changes, or you can go the 505(b)(2) route. So that's really your call.
So here is one other important difference for prospective applicants to keep in mind. So we talked about if you have a duplicate product, you have to come in through the J pathway, 505J. However, and we have seen examples of this, if there is if you are proposing a product that has, say, 6 different strengths, let's say they're tablets, and in the Orange Book, there's a otherwise duplicate product, but it only contains 5 of those 6 strengths. You, the applicant, actually have the choice to bundle those all together in one application, and in that scenario, it would be a B2 application because that 6th strength doesn't exist already in the Orange Book. So when you bundle it together, it gives you the option of coming in as a 505(b)(2). You also could have the choice of carving out those 5 that are the same, submitting a generic for that, and coming in as a B2 perhaps for that odd strength.
So the information to support approval. In the B2 application contains information to support any differences between the proposed drug product and the listed drug. In the ANDA, you can add additional information or studies to support approval so long as the purpose is not to establish safety and effectiveness. So that's been the key we've been talking about throughout this presentation. Investigations to establish safety and effectiveness go beyond what is permitted in an ANDA. Another important scientific consideration is active ingredient sameness. So proposed generic drug product is generally the same as the RLD with respect to its active ingredient or ingredients. Proposed drug product should not be submitted in ANDA if the active ingredient cannot be demonstrated to be the same as in the RLD by using the information that can be submitted in the ANDA. And that references back to our previous slide. So for formulation, your ANDA must include information regarding the identity and quantity of all active and inactive ingredients, a characterization of any permitted differences between the formulations of the proposed drug product and the RLD, as stated in our regulations, and a justification demonstrating that the safety and effectiveness is not adversely affected by those differences.
So a couple of other considerations here. If you are proposing an application that contains changes to formulations that are not permissible in an ANDA, so in other words, it can't be done through a suitability petition, then you would consider coming through as a B2. As an example, a proposed parenteral drug product that contains an additional inactive ingredient that is not present in the RLD, and that cannot be considered an exception excipient. And we see those pretty frequently, that you would come through as a B2 NDA. Also, another example, if you have a proposed drug product that contains a novel excipient that is going to require some sort of clinical testing to establish the safety, that knocks you out of what we would accept as an ANDA, and you would submit that as a 505(b)(2) NDA. This we don't see a lot of, but there's a couple considerations on this slide. If an applicant intentionally is proposing a product whose rate or extent of absorption are different from the standards that would be accepted as a J, a 505J, in order to prove bioequivalence, then that application would be appropriate as a B2 submission. And the second bullet, we have seen a few of these over the years. we refer to these as failed generics. So again, keep in mind, a generic is a duplicate of a product where you have to demonstrate bioequivalence. So if you are proposing a duplicate product, and that was your intent, and it just so happens that your bioequivalence studies failed, you can't now say, never mind, and come to the B2 door and say, okay, I want to be a B2 now. We will refuse to file it, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, because you are still a duplicate of a product that's in the Orange Book. You just happen to fail your bioequivalence study. So that's another thing to keep in the back of your mind. You would have to, what you would probably have to do is perhaps reformulate your product so that it would meet the standards to be a generic, demonstrate bioequivalence.
So conditions of use. Your ANDA must include a statement that the conditions of use prescribed, recommended, or suggested in the labeling have been previously approved in that RLD you're referencing. A proposed drug product should not be submitted in an ANDA if changes to the product are such that the proposed labeling no longer reflects what's in that RLD's conditions of use. And now, with the proliferation of complex generic drug products, we have now considerations for device constituent parts. So a proposed generic drug-device combination product may have a device constituent part that has some differences in design from the RLD. If you were designing a product such as this, I would recommend you review our guidance on comparative analyses. There was also a guidance recently issued by the Office of Combination Products in February on pre-market pathways for combination products. Those are two good references. Labeling, as you can tell just by the amount of text on this slide, your B2 application, your labeling doesn't have to match a listed drug. However, for your ANDA, you must contain information to show that the labeling proposed is the same as that for the RLD. There are some permissible differences, and those are due to different manufacturers. Examples of these differences are the expiration date, formulation, bioavailability, or pharmacokinetics, labeling revisions made to comply with current guidelines or carve-outs.
And getting back to 505(b)(2) applications, we often see where the product is otherwise a duplicate of a product in the Orange Book, but they're seeking a new indication. So again, in that regard, then it's not a duplicate. If they're seeking a new indication that's not part of the reference listed drug or any listed drug in the Orange Book, then it would be a B2. And as has been mentioned a few times now, if any of the differences between the products would require investigations to establish safety or effectiveness, that would also be a B2 application. And the labeling differences, Elizabeth just mentioned with some minor exceptions to labeling, but for the most part, if you are seeking to develop a product where the labeling differences are no longer the same as the reference listed drug, your B2 alarm should be going off, and you should consider the B2 pathway.
So how to get help from us. So if you are developing a drug product and it's intended to have the same active ingredient, conditions of use, route of administration, dosage form, strength, labeling, you're proposing a non-clinical study program and you think you might be an ANDA, contact OGD.
And as I mentioned, if you are different than a listed drug in the Orange Book, and again, so that's the key word, if you're different in some way, that would probably make you a B2 application. And if you're interested in pursuing the B2 pathway, you should contact the Office of New Drugs, and specifically you would start with the Chief Project Management staff in the review division where that application would be submitted.
So some more information for potential ANDAs. Here are the links to our guidance on controlled correspondence and our guidance on pre-ANDA meetings, which are appropriate for complex drug products.
And for B2s, even if you're going to be leveraging in the full Monty of information from the listed drug, and you really aren't going to be doing any kind of preclinical work, you still should consult early with the review division in O&D to begin the conversation. And so what I would recommend is to submit at a minimum, a pre-NDA meeting request with the review division, just so you can make sure you have the conversations about what your bridge will be, what listed drugs you might be relying on, will you be relying on literature, et cetera.
here's some final references. We have our determining whether to submit an ANDA or 505(b)(2) application draft guidance out from 2017. And we also have a draft guidance on 505(b)(2) applications. So check them out. And it's panel time.